But ultimately, if you have enough prosperity, if we have a superabundance of labor, if we have a superabundance of clean energy, if we have a superabundance of clean and not impactful transportation and food, then that prosperity will just be overwhelming.
Hey, y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. Guess who I am with again? It has been maybe a year or so, but I'm with Adam Dorr from RethinkX. And apropos of a monster document that you all put out that I think everyone should be paying attention to, both in terms of like celebrating, but also perhaps, you know, holding your head and screaming in fear, because it's the kind of disruption we're talking about is going to make everything else pale, I think. I mean, we talked last year, and if people haven't caught that video, you can check it out up here if you're interested. But we talked about, you know, the future of abundance and the future of energy and everything. This time, in fact, I'll just bring this thing up here so people can see it, because this time we are the horses. I think that should maybe alert people to this. So first of all, Adam, thank you for being here. You wrote this along with Tony Seba. And again, as soon as I asked his name, I apologize. Introduce the other folks that wrote this with you. It's a big document. It's very important.
So it's three co-authors on this one. One of the founders of RethinkX, Tony Seba, who probably needs no introduction to most people who are listening. He's our founder, along with James Arbib, who was the other co-founder of RethinkX, myself, and Dr. Brad Libby, who is a research fellow also at RethinkX. So it's this is the first and only the first piece that we've put out as speaking to the fourth major foundational sector disruption. We've already done work on energy, transportation, and food, as if those weren't a big enough deal already. Right. Now this one is the disruption of labor. Right. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about here.
Okay. Well, we're going to start with I guess the big picture. I guess, first of all, what is labor? I mean, I know probably most people think they know, but maybe we can help define it a little bit more precisely. And then we can talk about why this is such a huge change.
Yeah, I think that's a great way. That's a great question. It's a great way to start. And there are surely a number of different ways to define and to think about what labor is. The way that we conceive of it in the context of this piece and in the context of the disruption of labor is as a market in which there's some trade or transactional basis, right? So in the past, up until now, labor was something that human beings did and would do in exchange, in contractual exchange via trade for compensation. That's the way to think about what we mean by labor in this context. It's not the only way to think about labor, and it's not synonymous with work necessarily, because a bulldozer does work, but you wouldn't necessarily say it does labor, right? Right. So that's probably the way to think about it. And then we employ terms like labor market, the global labor market, and again, one could point to a number of different valid definitions of what that might mean from certain perspectives. From our perspective here, it's the total scale of labor's contribution to the economy that's legible or visible by according to metrics like GDP. That would be the way to conceive of what labor means in this context. And so when we say that is going to be disrupted by AI and robotics, and in humanoid robotics in particular, that is the thing we're talking about being the target, being in the crosshairs. It's human beings who are toiling and working and exchanging their blood, sweat, and tears for compensation on a market basis throughout the global economy.
Okay. So that's actually really helpful for me, honestly, because thinking of it as somewhat agentic, and there is the question down below. I noticed you put the thing until the robots become conscious, which is a really interesting question, perhaps outside of today's scope of discussion. But you know, a hammer does work, but a hammer is not labor, because a hammer has to be wielded by some sort of agent, like a person that would hammer something in. And so that would count as labor then. So that does change things a lot. And it also explains why these humanoid robots are a little bit different than, we've had industrial robots since the 1960s or 70s, and I think GM was the first one that used them. So we've had those entities around for a long time, but they don't really, you wouldn't think of them as doing labor. They do work. You set them up in the factory and they go and they move things around. So this changes things substantially. These humanoid robots, because of what? Their intelligence, their ability to work flexibly, their ability to do multiple tasks. Not that they just do one task over and over again, and that's the only thing they'll ever do, that they can do multiple tasks. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about that differentiates this?
Yeah, I think that's I would say that's correct, or close enough to it that nobody should really feel the need to split hairs or nitpick the details. In my own work, I distinguish automation from mechanization. And so those are maybe two words that you could anchor the difference in ideas you just mentioned too. I'm not saying necessarily that that's the only way or the best way to think about it, but that's the way that I personally think about it, and that I think reflects my team's thinking as well. So mechanization is the kind of thing that we've done in the past. You mentioned a hammer, we mentioned a bulldozer. Right. You can use a machine to perform useful work. And we've had stunning, spectacular success with that with machines. I mean, a bulldozer can do more work in an hour than 100 men with shovels can do in a month. But it's not labor; it's capital performing work. It's machinery performing work, and it's mechanized as opposed to what is the alternative to mechanization. Mechanization implies no intelligence there, and automation is perhaps a better word for capturing the idea of work being done with the guidance of intelligence and with something closer to agency, not agency in the self-aware and sentient sense necessarily, but something closer to the adaptability and the flexibility and the potential to, for example, be error correcting. So not fragile, not brittle in its performance and functionality, the way that mechanization is, and certainly not requiring a human in the loop. A hammer still needs to be wielded by a person, like you said. A bulldozer still needs a driver, but if they are automated, then they can perform labor autonomously. So I think that's sort of the a reasonable way to think about it, I would argue.
Okay. And then I think we can actually look at this. This was kind of the first thing that the paper talks about, and this is not new with you guys. I mean, it's new. Tony and you have put forth many of these graphs, and these are very small here, but I'll of course leave a link to the original blog post, which will go into much more detail, folks. So definitely read that along with this piece. But many over the years, like since the 1800s, where you have data all the way up to like VHS physical media versus digital downloads, everything in that range follows this basic X curve. So you have an adoption curve, which is like an S curve that goes up, which would be the white curves in all of these graphics. And then of course you have the de-adoption curve for the old technology that's no longer valid. And of course you highlighted down here that horses, and that's why the interesting thing, say when we are horses, it's like, well, between 1900 and 1930, horses went from being incredibly useful to incredibly not useful and are just kind of play toys that people have around for the most part. So what does that leave us as human beings in that case? If we are the horses, where do we end up? Are we all going to the glue factory? Is that what's happening to us?
We can do a lot better than that, right?
Okay, I mean,
the larger point that these examples of disruption show, these are X curves, disruption X curves, and we like to say X marks disruption. And the point is that what we've seen throughout history is a recurring pattern. In fact, we do have some cases with reasonably good data, archaeological data, for example, that go back thousands of years, millennia. So we have evidence that Neolithic arrowheads had an adoption pattern that was an X-shaped pattern, an exponential initial adoption period of the S curve, followed by a tapering off, corresponding collapse of the old way of doing things, the old way of making and using arrowheads, and that all proceeded over the course of just a couple of decades, effectively in that era, one generation. So we've seen this pattern again and again and again throughout history, and for technologies of all different kinds, right? That's another very deep point here. It's not just digital technologies. It's not just tech from the modern era. We're talking about things as different as car tires and fabric dyes are from Neolithic arrowheads and digital cameras and horses and cars. Now, to the point of horses and cars, well, that was extraordinary, right? We used horses for transportation for thousands of years. They were a totally embedded, incumbent technology. They were how we moved for many centuries, and it didn't take 100 years to replace them with automobiles. It only took 15 years or so in any given location, and then for the world, about 30 years, right? So
I was going to say, sorry, I was just bringing up a thought. I listened to the Fall of Ancient Civilizations podcast, and they did an episode on a South American, actually Central American. It was the old Mexican, we're in Central America where Mexico is now, but that they had the massive disadvantage that the Europeans, when they came over, had horses and they didn't. And that they could only move at the speed of foot traffic, and that these people, the Europeans could move at the speed of horses, and that technological disruption just completely flattened them out. They had no chance of competing. That's that sort of standard indigenous tribe, but they were flourishing civilizations, but they just had no chance of competing because of that technology. So we're looking at, I think, if I'm not overstepping it, we're looking at that kind of a thing right now. And you talk about national security being an issue, right? This is a big deal. If you're one of the laggards in this race, then you have a chance of just being those indigenous people that are just going to get rolled over by the higher technology group. Is that
it's certainly race conditions now, right? And the way to think about it is that it is a race to the top. I mean, we're all headed upward. It's an upward trajectory for everyone. And like other races, there will be disproportionately large rewards to be obtained by the winners of this race. But something important to understand, I think, in this case, and it's true for the other disruptions as well, in energy and transport and food, that the rules are changing, and it's anyone's game. It's anyone's race to win. And when I say that, I mean a smaller country, even a city in a region on a regional basis could prove to be a winner, could be high up on the leaderboard if it makes choices to embrace and adapt to the disruption of labor with this new technology sooner, rather than being a laggard, rather than waiting, rather than trying to play catch up later. And so this is really important because it means that it isn't just the largest countries today with the most economic might today that are necessarily going to be the winners. It is a choice, and that's exciting. But I think ultimately, as with all disruptions, everyone is on this upward trajectory. In the same way that we just saw that with the disruption of information and communications, also a foundational sector of the economy, over the last 30 years with the internet. We've all just seen that. It's fresh in memory. And the world before the internet was totally different than the world after the internet. And it didn't take 100 years for that transformation to occur. The first website was maybe 1993. First browser, Mosaic, that was when there was an internet before that, but that was when the internet and the World Wide Web launched into the public consciousness. And it was just 15 years later, right? In 2007, 2008, we have the iPhone, and people are buying things through their smartphone through the internet. And in the 1990s, there were still many holdouts saying, "Oh, you've got to be crazy to buy anything over the internet," right? So it's going to be the same in these in all of these other foundational sectors: energy, transportation, food, and labor.
Okay.
And that is what to expect based on all of the historical data and based on an understanding of the core dynamics, the drivers of technology disruption, right? A new technology or set of them comes along, they converge, and they're able to offer an overwhelmingly competitive alternative, a much more compelling value proposition than the older technology was able to offer. And economizing on value is just something that humans have enormous incentive to do at every scale, from the individual all the way up to the nation. So it's that economizing logic, ultimately economic forces that drive disruptions to occur so swiftly. And as we saw with the internet, it was a race to the top. Everybody's crossed the finish line at this point. I mean, there are, I shouldn't say everybody. That's not fair, and that's unkind to communities in remote areas and in places of disadvantage where internet service is still lacking, and that's unacceptable. But to a first approximation, the internet is now available worldwide in every country, and this was humanity as a whole being elevated, right?
Right.
Now, there were winners in that race. And the winners in that race, the regions that adopted the most swiftly, that led the internet charge, they're still riding on the benefits of having captured, those rewards. Silicon Valley is still thriving on the success of having led in the digital revolution, right? So this is the same situation again, and the same lessons and the same operative logic all applies.
Right. Interesting. So yeah, that's, and if you think about the internet, certainly there was that long beginning, starting in the 60s with the DARPA, anyway, but it went like that. But from between 1993 and 1998, we kind of went from like 10% to 70 or 80%, at least in the developed world, using it. I mean, it was incredibly fast. And I remember buying books on Amazon in the late 1990s. And that's just a couple of years after the whole thing started, really. So it's incredible how fast it happened. So I want to point this out. I've had this up. I also want you to help me with autocatalysis. But anyway, the blue highlight part down here, the advantages of humanoid robots are so stark at every level of analysis, from individual firms to industries to regions and entire nations, that it's obvious we are now under race conditions to deploy humanoid robots as fast as possible. That's what you were talking about. And then, of course, this is Insight 13. Autocatalysis of human robot production will be key to the success of both individual firms and national economies. So first of all, autocatalysis, what does that mean?
Well, that auto means self, and catalysis means acceleration or enabling, right? So a catalyst is something that enables and accelerates a reaction to occur, or some activity to occur. And so autocatalysis means self-acceleration. And what we're really talking about there in this case is this extraordinary potential of robots to very early on in the disruption, very early on in their rollout, their deployment, to close the loop and feed back into their own production, their own development, their own deployment. And that like all feedback loops, can spell acceleration, a virtuous, positive reinforcing loop that can accelerate us up this trajectory of initially exponential growth. So up the first portion of the adoption S curve. And the potential there is so extraordinary that where that opportunity is seized, it's likely to prove to be a large advantage. That's what we're anticipating here. And there are other examples one could point to of autocatalysis, of self-reinforcement, self-acceleration. A quick example to mention is, think about something like solar panels or wind turbines. Once you start making and deploying those, and they start generating electricity, you can use that electricity in the factory that makes the solar panels and the wind turbines, and that's like closing the loop. And that can be another example of where the output is used to accelerate further generation of more output at the same time. Right. Robots, because we're talking about labor here, and labor is so fundamental as an input into any productive process, any supply chain, any link in any supply chain, in any industry, for any good and service, ultimately. Since we're talking about labor, I think the potential of that flywheel to be extremely powerful is really quite extraordinary. And we think keep a watchful eye on autocatalysis, and a winning strategy for regions that want to be leaders in the adoption and deployment of robotics will do well to consider investment in self-acceleration, in autocatalysis.
Gotcha. And it is, I mean, you talked about some antecedents for it, but it is somewhat unprecedented, because it may be overstating the case a little bit, but it's kind of like being able to reproduce themselves. And I know that's not complete, because I can't go dig up the minerals and things like that yet. But to some extent, we're talking about robots, because they can do the labor, being able to build new robots, which is effectively reproduction in a way. And that allows that kind of incredible exponential ramp that you just can't get with a mechanical, if it's limited by human labor, you can only build so many cars a year. I know there's a market, but even if we had an infinite market, you couldn't build an infinite number of automobiles a year. Whereas with these robots, you kind of can do that, because eventually if you get too many on the planet, they can just go off into space. You can build ones that are, like, I mean, maybe that's even bizarre for you, but I'm like, there's no limitation. They're not meat bags. They're not stuck here on Earth. You can send them up. They can go mine the moon or go mine an asteroid or go live on Mars or whatever and just keep reproducing.
Well, certainly up until this point in human history, labor has been the ultimate limiting factor. I mean,
right.
That's not to say that other factors aren't also sometimes or often limiting. Energy is a limiting factor and so forth. But certainly labor has been a longstanding limiting factor on how productive you can be, how much value you can create, right? It's been a hard limit in every productive system. And certainly that's true today in the modern global economy, right? Adam Smith said that the real value of everything is the labor that goes into it, and that's what he was pointing towards. So this is a venerable and very well established idea, right? The idea that labor as a factor of production is really quite fundamental, and it's often the limiting factor. What we're talking about here, when you're talking about being able to manufacture labor, when you're talking about being able to manufacture your labor force, you blow open that what has been up until now a fundamental constraint on the system, a fundamental constraint on the growth of one's economy. And the economy can be misleading because we freight so many assumptions into what an economy is when we think about it. But at its most fundamental, an economy is the mode by which human beings and civilization creates and distributes value. And that's extremely important because value is scarce. So it's not so much that resources are scarce, but that the transformation of resources into valuable goods and services is scarce. It's fundamentally been difficult to do at the scale and with the distribution that we would ideally like, right? And so if you indulge a science fiction sort of leap to a limit, you can imagine, the Star Trek scenario where everything you could want is available in any quantity at the push of a button. The Star Trek replicator that just 3D prints and fabricates. You can imagine instantly, right? We're a very, very, very long way away from that, and you don't really need you don't really have an economy of scarcity in sort of this distant limit case, this distant science fiction scenario. So we've been very far away from that for a long time. But what we're talking about here is a huge leap potentially towards a kind of abundance, a kind of material and productive abundance that, well, frankly, up until this point has genuinely been the realm of science fiction. So we don't know where this ends. We don't know where this goes. But what we can say, I think, with confidence is that when you blow open what were previously fundamental constraints, you're going to get some truly radical new circumstances, a new kind of system with new properties. You're going to need new metrics to measure it and understand it. You're going to need new institutions to manage and govern it. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us. I struggle to find words to express how totally profound the disruption of labor is going to be. The situation we're in it's really almost without precedent. You would certainly have to reach for examples like the advent of electricity, the invention of fire and writing. These sort of truly just cornerstones, just the pillars upon which humanity and human civilization rest. I mean, we're talking about shaking those fundamental pillars in every bit as big of a way as fire and the wheel and writing and electricity did. That's what humanoid robots stand to do. Because
and the difference, though, even beyond that, is that let's take the invention of agriculture. So absolutely, society is civilizationally changing. In fact, it created civilization, arguably, but that took thousands of years to sort of distribute around the earth. And there are still nomadic tribes around today. This is the kind of thing that could happen in, like you're saying, 10 to 15 years. I mean, even if you're optimistic, say 20 to 25 years, this is a lifetime of, not even a lifetime, just, a short part of a lifetime of a person. That is not that much time. And I was going to put this into, you mentioned the numbers here. I was going to put this into perspective. If you want to think about labor, if you want to grow a new human laborer, and I know this is a very it's a very weird way to think about it, but you want to grow a new person to do useful labor, it's about $300,000 and about 20 years, not counting if they want to become a specialist and a doctor, and then, you can just tack on double that or whatever. But so even if a robot cost $100,000 or $200,000, if you can build it in a half an hour or a couple of hours, that's the critical part. It's like, okay, so even if they're very expensive at the beginning, you can make a new laborer come online. You can have multiple ones per day rather than having to wait 20 years plus to have a new one.
Right.
That's incredible. That's the kind of thing that just makes your mind explode when you think about that.
Well, certainly, and the associated constraints of space and other resources aren't there either, right? So there's only so fast a human population can grow, as you said. There's also only so large of a human population that a given area can support.
Right.
And we don't know what the limits are with robotics, but they're certainly far higher than the limits with human beings, because robots don't need to be housed. They don't need to have the same sort of food production. I mean, we have to power them, but we're talking about almost certainly they will be powered overwhelmingly by clean electricity. And the potential for the density of labor availability, even in geographically small areas. So think down on the scale of a city, for example. A city, there's only so many people you can put in an area, even at inhumane levels of population density. But for robotics, those limits are perhaps an order of magnitude or two greater. And so what this means is that even relatively small nations, even cities that chose to aggressively adopt humanoid robotics, could have an enormous labor force very quickly.
Yeah. And there's a couple of other things. I do want to touch on energy, because a lot of people, one of the arguments they make, there's two arguments here. We're going to talk about energy and the humanoid form factor, which you address both of these. But the energy ties directly into, of course, RethinkX's other discussions about these other phase changes and the fact that the marginal cost of energy is going towards zero. And we're seeing it happen right now. But a really interesting thing, I was reading Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, and she discusses Bitcoin as a user of energy that's able to go to the energy source because it doesn't care. So you can go to a waterfall that's really far from civilization. So an interesting aspect of this that I started thinking about with humanoid bots is they're the same thing. So let's say there was an interesting, you could get some rare earth minerals out of an area that's just really far away, but it has a waterfall or it has a lot of sunlight or some way of getting energy to it easily. You don't have to send humans there. You could have an entire robot colony that was doing useful labor and using the energy that's there that's wasted otherwise. Nobody's going to take that energy off that waterfall if they can't get to it. So that's just energy that's wasted. So I don't know if you've thought about that specifically, but it really was intriguing to me to start connecting up all of these ideas and using otherwise wasted energy. So not going like, oh, they're going to take all our energy. It's like, no. It's different than that.
Well, I mean, again, the scope for deployment of robotic labor is just greater than the scope for deployment of human labor. I mean, you human beings have to have housing. They have to have food, they have to have safe working conditions. And so there are a lot of places where it's difficult to, not impossible, of course, but very difficult. And that translates directly into very expensive circumstances to do it safely and in an acceptably humane way. And of course, we have circumstances today, as everyone well knows, where it isn't done humanely, where we do pursue resources, for example, that aren't obtained in a humane or socially or ethically or morally acceptable fashion. But with robotics, those constraints, those very human constraints, don't apply. And so one could imagine robots working in environments that are just too hostile, too remote, too dangerous for human beings to operate in. And we could think of a number of things. You mentioned, for example, very high latitudes, places that are very cold. We could imagine, for example, underground. I mean, there's only so far underground that a human being can operate in a mine before it gets too dangerous, too difficult, too hot.
And just psychologically, there's a psychological aspect of absolutely. And so I think what this spells for us is just a broader space of possibilities in which resources may be obtained and
you know me, a major part of my orientation and primary, well, frankly, mission professionally is related to the environment. It's a key focus of my work and personal interest and passion. And so when we think about, can we do things within this larger possibility space that humanoid robotic labor opens up compared to human labor, we could be doing things in a much more environmentally sustainable, much less ecologically impactful way as well. And of course, we're going to be able to do all of that much more affordably than we ever could with human labor. So there are advantages on virtually every dimension when you compare human labor to robotic labor.
Yeah. This actually kind of ties in, I don't have it right here, but that ties into your point number one, which is, and somehow the PDF screwed it up, but basically the idea that this is inevitable, that you know, every time technology has enabled 10x or more cost reduction relative to the incumbent system, disruption has always followed. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. I think Tony always says it's like gravity, right? It's like the laws of physics, basically. If you do this, it's going to happen. And you know, you just mentioned, I think the early, I can't remember the numbers exactly, it's in the PDF file, but basically it's you know, even if they're very expensive right now, they're going to be like on the order of $10 an hour when you amortize the cost and everything, which is cheaper than, in most countries, it's cheaper than the hourly rate for human labor. But then that drop, it's going to, just like energy is going towards a marginal cost of zero, labor is going to approach a marginal cost of zero. And it wasn't even that long. Did you say like by 2050-ish or something along those lines, it's going to be, you know, down to like a penny an hour or something?
Well, I think
like
there's I mean, we are going to put out some work about the cost curve, the cost trajectory of humanoid robotics. And so I won't get into specific numbers here at this point, but I think that it's reasonable to expect. I think we have every reason to expect something like an order of magnitude decrease every decade, something along those lines, and you know, plus or minus, give or take. But it's pretty. I think there's a very clear trajectory to go from $200,000 per bot to $20,000, which is approximately the cost of a compact car. And humanoid robots are likely to be comparable in complexity and manufacturing difficulty to an automobile. They're unlikely to be significantly more challenging than that. Their cost of materials will be fundamentally lower because they're not as large as an automobile. And then at the scale, the truly titanic scale we're talking about for supply and demand of these billions of units numbers at the scale of smartphones, we're likely to see costs fall well under 20,000, and perhaps in the longer term, so out into the 2040s, one could imagine a trajectory of them reaching, say, a tenth of that, $2,000 per unit. How? Well, one way you would do that is by employing autocatalysis. If you have very, very inexpensive labor with which to manufacture humanoid robots and very, very inexpensive energy, well, those are two key cost centers in manufacturing, right? And so I don't think it's unreasonable at all to expect that sort of approaching those sorts of numbers on a time horizon of, say, 2 decades, 20 years. And 20 years is not long ago, or not long, right? And it's not long from now. 20 years wasn't that long ago, right? 2004 wasn't that long ago. And 20 years is not that long from now. So I think that this line of reasoning is, even if the numbers aren't perfect, the direction of travel and the general territory is where is absolutely that is the key takeaway point here. It's not whether the cost will be, you know, 40 cents an hour or 30 cents an hour, and it's not whether that will be in 2042 or 2044. The point is that it's going to be radically lower than human minimum wage, and very shortly, and it will continue to plunge. Over the next couple of decades.
It's different.
As Tony says, forces like that are like gravity. They just spell disruption. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, and that's the inevitability. Because I think to put it very concretely, if people are thinking, well, $10 an hour isn't that much cheaper than minimum wage for a person working at McDonald's or something like that in the US, and equivalent in many countries to minimum wage or the effective minimum wage. But when you get down to $1 an hour, that, then you start thinking is like, how do you compete with that? There is no
Right.
way. And so that's just going to happen. So I wanted to take a look at this. I have a lot of questions, but I just, these are sort of the enablers that I think I kind of highlighted them, that have all sort of arrived at the same time, similar to the way the iPhone sort of happened in 2007, 2008, because the convergent technologies, you had the internet, you had the touch screen, you had the batteries, you had the processing power, all of that stuff came together. So I don't know, take me through it. What do we have here? What is 2024 bringing us that wasn't here before?
Well, for sure, the elephant in the room here, the big advancement that has spurred on the explosion of interest in and investment in and acceleration of development of robotics is AI, right? It's artificial intelligence technology, and so we've seen some extraordinary demonstrations of new capability over the last couple of years. Virtually everybody will be familiar with generative AI, with language models that from the perspective of just a decade ago seemed like something straight out of science fiction. We're talking about ChatGPT and the latest models are basically able to pass what was originally conceived of as a Turing test. They are very difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish from a human being that you might be having a text-based chat with. They're truly extraordinary. This capability has been a long time in the making. I mean, these have been improvements that have accumulated and so forth over a long period of time. There have been key breakthroughs along the way, surely, but what we've seen is the emergence of that capability over the last couple of years, and that has thrown open the floodgates. Right now, what also needs to converge with the AI is the hardware side of things, and there we've got extraordinary advancements in hand now, thanks to the driving forces that have led to the improvement of, say, for example, sensor technology, battery technology in other devices, other products. So, in portable electronics and electric vehicles, we've seen forces drive the improvement of electrochemical batteries, right? Especially of the lithium-ion family, but all of the different prominent electrochemical chemistries that are available. The humanoid robots are going to benefit enormously from having the batteries of today and not the batteries that we had 30 years ago, right? The same is true for sensors. The enormous demand, the enormous scale of smartphones has led to the improvement in both performance and in cost of sensors like cameras and microphones and accelerometers and so forth. These are all going to be very useful. They're going to find application in robotics, and certainly this applies to the other hardware as well, actuators and so forth. So these technologies are all now, like you said, converging to together offer this extraordinary value proposition that simply wasn't possible any earlier than this historically. It's only possible now when you have all of the ingredients together, right? And that's what we're seeing. It's only just now become possible, and so it really is like it's like the smartphone being nascent, being imminent in 2006. The iPhone, not technically the first smartphone, but perhaps the first breakout success of putting all of those ingredients together in spectacularly useful and therefore competitive form was 2007, right? And then the smartphone, and that was the iPhone 1. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't flawless, and compared to a modern smartphone, it had great limitations, but it was the beginning. It was the beginning of a totally new kind of experience with that sort of product, and it's a directly analogous situation today with humanoid robots. Convergence of technologies, the capability is finally here to offer something competitive, something compelling, but this is just the beginning, and price is only going to plummet and quality is only going to skyrocket from here. These are the most expensive and the least capable these robots are ever going to be.
And it seems like every day we see incredible improvements with them too. You know, the demos that come out, we're just like, geez, you know, you said 10 years ago, honestly, I feel like the chat GPT stuff, even in 2020 would have seemed like science fiction. It just wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
It has happened really fast. So one complaint that people have, and I don't agree with this, but I want to get your take on this, is they're like, the human form factor is stupid. Just build purpose-built robots to do whatever, picking and placing, or driving a bulldozer, or whatever it is. So why the humanoid form factor?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of key reasons. The first is that the human form is a demonstrably successful general purpose platform. I mean, human beings are pretty darn successful. There are a lot of other existence proofs in biology, a lot of other types of animals.
Right.
And not all of them have the same sort of general capability that we do. The human form is pretty darn good as far as being adaptable, being amenable to tool use, and being flexible in different environments and applications goes, right? If you look at another form factor, say for example, a dolphin. Well, dolphins don't have opposable thumbs, and it's difficult for them to operate on land, and they're not very good climbers, you know, right? So the human form is not bad as a general platform. We simply have the existence proof of humanity's success to show us that. Now, whether it's the truly optimal general purpose platform or not, maybe that's not. Maybe strictly speaking, that's not the case. It could be that having wheels is just sort of generally better. It could be that having something more like a crab or an arthropod sort of design might be better for general purposes. But human beings are good enough. We're pretty darn good generalists.
Right.
Okay. So the value of generality is enormous. And that is a key takeaway here. The value of being general purpose is enormous. Why? Because unlike human beings, robots can be reskilled and redeployed basically instantly.
Right.
Quite literally overnight.
It's like the Matrix. So, plug it in. I know Kung Fu. Yeah, you know.
I mean, quite literally. So what that means is that any individual unit, any individual bot it can work in any different domain at any time. You can work in a factory one day, a warehouse the next day, a restaurant the next day, and on the battlefield the day after that.
Right.
Reskilling, it's not like a person, where people take a very long time to reskill and they take a long time to deploy.
Right.
What that means is that there is enormous value, greater even than with human beings and human labor, in generality as opposed to specialization, because of this redeployability and ease of skill transferability. So I think what's certainly in the near term, one would reasonably expect general purpose robots to enjoy enormous success by virtue of those properties, right? That's the thing. Then you also have the consideration that, well, the entire human world right now is built to the human form, and roughly speaking, the human scale as well. I mean, you could have a humanoid form, but 15 feet tall, and you wouldn't fit in most buildings, right?
That would be a problem.
Or if you were, 1 foot tall, things would be out of reach and so forth. So the human-built environment, the human-built world, is, as a tautology, is self-evidently designed and scaled and matched to human proportions and human capabilities and limitations. So that's a reason to, in the near term, figure that a humanoid bot will be a successful form factor. And then the final thing is frankly, it's just familiar, right? I mean, so even if a wheeled robot or a crab-like or spider-like robot was a little bit better, it would creep people out. And which would you rather have, working alongside you in a factory, or folding your laundry in your house, or that sort of thing, or serving you in a restaurant, or doing customer service in a retail location, something like that. I think one doubts the importance of that familiarity at your peril. That is probably a larger factor than you might otherwise think on a purely rational basis. Human beings aren't rational, and given the choice, we're going to take something that's familiar and it feels non-threatening over something that's marginally a little bit better in absolute terms, but just creeps us out or is frightening. And so I think that all of those factors together suggest that, at least in the near term, I think we say for the next decade or so, we should imagine that the humanoid bot will be the dominant form, as opposed to a proliferation of specialized forms of robotics. Although that will eventually come. I think that's reasonable to expect that will eventually come. And we can also, I mean, again, we can draw inference from the existence proofs in biology. Ecological niches abound. There are lots of different ways to succeed in an ecosystem. And so specialization is very much a thing, and we ought to expect that with robotics as well. But here in the near term, humanoid robots seem the obvious horse to bet on for now.
Yeah. Okay. The familiarity thing is actually really important. I think about it like, obviously in the future, assuming this takes off like we expect it to, something like a spider type robot to build skyscrapers or something would be an ideal form factor. Humans are really bad at balancing on tall things, and we don't have, but it's going to take a while for us humans to evolve to the point where we're like, okay, that doesn't just completely freak me out. And I don't think that the end of the world is coming when I see one of these things on a building, going up and down, constructing things. So yeah, that's actually a very good point about that, and all of the others as well. So I'm just going to touch on this briefly. We don't have to go into this a lot, but you do mention this in the report. It says, as long as these robots are not conscious, we can think about tasks. So I'm going to get into the tasks. So I thought that was a really interesting redefinition of work or labor. But first of all, what does that mean to you? What is this until they are conscious thing?
Well, the point there is that one of the distinctions, I should say it differently. One of the properties of a job is that it entails rights and responsibilities, contractual obligations. And in order to have rights, responsibilities, and obligations, one needs to have personhood. One needs to have moral and legal status. And sentience seems to be the core criteria by which one would ascribe or have ascribed to them personhood and those other attributes, right? And so, again, this may strike some people as rather far-fetched science fiction, but artificial intelligence is presumably on a trajectory to eventually reach the point where sentience is undeniable.
Right.
And at that stage, at that point, we reach a situation where employing or deploying artificial intelligence to perform work would require the same sort of moral and legal considerations that we give to all persons because of their status, having personhood, and then having a claim to rights as well as responsibilities and obligations. So that's what that is speaking to, and it's a hedge against something that certainly could and absolutely would be momentous if it in the future, right? The emergence of general intelligence and then agentic or sentient, sapient.
Yeah. And thank you for saying
intelligence.
That. I always say AGI is just a fancy hammer. It's when you get to agentic intelligence, that's when things really, when it has a desire that it wants to do on its own, that's a different matter entirely. And the whole thing of consciousness, a lot of people split hairs, but I think from a functional sense, at some point, like I assume that you're conscious, you assume I'm conscious. We can't prove that about each other. So at some point, they're going to pass some sort of bar where it's like, well, we can't disprove that they're conscious. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. You pretty much have to call it a duck. And at that point, yeah, you do have to start thinking about them as actual kind of equivalents of humans.
I certainly hope so. And I certainly hope we learn the lessons, the hard-fought, dreadfully painful lessons of history.
Yes.
Because for a very long time, we didn't ascribe personhood and all of the rights and privileges and responsibilities and obligations to all people, to all human beings. We didn't ascribe them to children. We didn't ascribe them to women. We didn't ascribe them to different populations of people,
right?
Because of whatever differences they might have, cultural or ethnic or whatever else. These were abominable failures and mistakes of our own past, and we I think it would behoove us to learn from our own history of errors and not make those same mistakes when humanity brings a new type of person into the world. And one could certainly argue, I certainly would argue, that we still run afoul morally of our obligations to many of the animals in the world that
Right.
we don't treat with sufficient respect, and we don't attribute sufficient moral and legal status to, again, because we don't grant them personhood, despite
Right.
clearly their sentience. Now, they may not be sapient, they may not be generally intelligent the way that human beings are, but certainly other mammals are capable of suffering. They have self-awareness to a degree, and
Right.
they're conscious, and they have emotional states and subjective experiences, and all the rest of it. And certainly young children do as well, of course.
Right.
And so this is still a mistake we're making, and something we still have a long way to go on.
Right. Right.
And then, of course, there's the then there's the final point, which is that, we probably ought to be nice to the robots if they might eventually become more intelligent and more powerful than we are, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely we're in a do unto others as you would have them do unto you sort of situation here.
Right. Yeah, there's a whole kind of joke thing going around on Twitter right now about people saying, like, I have never supported the pushing or knocking down of robots, because that's like the standard test where they poke them over and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I support that too, because I want the robots to go back and check the records and go like, oh, he didn't support that. So yeah. So someday they'll just walk down the street and push us over and be like, how does it feel?
Right. Yep. So make sure your kids say please and thank you to
exactly.
the chat bots and and when they have them in their homes to the humanoid bots. It's a good practice to develop those manners for when they do eventually become sentient.
Yeah, because they'll remember everything. They will go like, do you remember on September 25th?
They'll never forget.
Exactly. So they'll know if you did it. So okay, so until that point, setting that aside, right now these are fancy hammers in a sense. So you redefine job to task, and why is that important to do?
Well, it's really about it's about establishing the correct unit of analysis. So this is sort of one of the basic steps for approaching anything scientifically, is to, if you're going to observe a phenomena and try to understand it, certainly if you're trying to model it, then you need to establish an appropriate unit of analysis. And what follows on from there also is establishing the correct metrics by which to measure, to evaluate what you're observing, and eventually to govern, to create institutions for operating and managing and organizing the things that you're interested in. Okay, so today it makes sense to think in terms of jobs as the unit of analysis, as the metric of interest, and for associated metrics like, for example, employment or unemployment. Those are relevant metrics to human beings because human beings engage in work primarily via jobs. Right. But a job is more than just the tasks that get done at work. A job involves, again, like we were saying before, contractual obligations and rights and responsibilities. Jobs typically entail the performance of many different tasks, not just one. Most jobs involve the performance of many, many different tasks. A job may involve, it may circumscribe the performance of new tasks you didn't anticipate. But nevertheless, it's still your responsibility to discover and execute tasks as necessary as part of your job. So this is quite a different unit of analysis than what humanoid robots will be initially, at least, deployed and doing. They will be employed to do tasks, to perform specific functions, and they will not have most of the other accoutrements that go along with the job. Certainly none of the personal things that go along with the job. For example, our jobs are often part of our personal identity. They can be part of our community identity. They can be part of our cultural heritage. I mean, if you're a fisherman from a fishing town, or a culture that has a heritage of fisheries, well, then that job means an awful lot more than just the specific tasks associated with fishing, right? Robots will not have all of those, all of that same complexity. Instead, the correct unit of analysis, we are arguing, is to think in terms of tasks. Now, one of the upshots there is that this helps us, having the right metric helps us avoid a common mistake we see when people are trying to understand technology disruption. And that is, a common mistake is thinking the new technology will simply be a one-to-one substitution or replacement of the old technology. That you're only going to swap out your old celluloid film camera with one new digital camera. And even if that's true temporarily, it tends not to be true in the long term. For example, our smartphones don't have just one camera on them.
Right.
The typical smartphone's got like 3 or 4 or 5 at this point, right?
So, yeah.
There was a brief period when a digital camera basically just looked like an old-fashioned film camera, but that was fleeting. And now those are increasingly relics from a bygone era. It will be something similar like that in this disruption. And again, this is a pattern. This is a fundamental pattern that we see in disruptions of all kinds. So it's important at the outset, in order to understand and plan for disruptions, make wise policy decisions and investment choices, for example, to have the right metric. And we believe the right metric here is tasks and certainly not jobs. Robots aren't going to have jobs, but they are going to do tasks. And so that's probably closer to the right way to think about it. Now, we're not saying we have the final word on this. This is the very beginning. But certainly this is an easy beginner's mistake that we can help folks avoid. Don't think about this in terms of jobs, and don't think about robots as taking away people's jobs. That is not the right way to think about it. They are going to be performing tasks in place of or alongside of human beings, and alongside of human jobs. They aren't going to be taking individuals' jobs. There are very few jobs in the world that mercifully, thankfully, that entail just the toil and drudgery of performing a single task over and over again.
Right. Yeah, and those are ones that probably most people would not be extremely unhappy about losing either. Hopefully, they would.
Those are the little hanging fruit for humanity.
Exactly.
We want. This is the age-old dream. We want machinery to be performing toil and drudgery, and not human beings. We want the same value to be created. We want the same productivity to occur in our societies. We want all the fruits. We just don't want the miserable labor that historically has been necessary to produce those fruits, the fruits of our labor, right? And so society can become much more fruitful. Society can become much more prosperous without any human being needing to toil or engage in drudgery. But that's going to take us a lot. That's another part of this conversation, or perhaps the next conversation that we need to have, which is about all of the social change that's coming and how to navigate.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to table that one for today a little bit, because I've got you. I know you have to go pick up your kid from soccer and stuff like that. I want to touch on a couple of things. Number one is just really briefly about quality, because I think this is a phase change also, and it's going to kind of tie into several other factors. So I think I've got it. I think I've got the end of the trajectory worked out. But you note specifically in this document that there's not going to be a rationale to shortcut anymore. Manufacturing cheap goods that are just garbage because you can do it for 15% or 50% less than somebody else can manufacture a quality good. Because if the marginal cost of labor goes down towards zero, why do that? What would be the point? Right. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. No, that's exactly it. That's a great way of putting it. One of the ways that we think about it is that the differential between a premium and a low end good that today is determined by cost is likely to contract, is likely to shrink. That difference, that gap between the two. And the reason why is because a large part, not all, but a large part of the difference in quality between a premium and a low end good is not just the cost of the materials. It's not just quality of the componentry and of the raw materials that goes into it. It is the precision and the care and the attention to detail and the consistency with which something is produced, whether its components are made and then assembled together. In fact, you may, like me and many others, may find watching a master craftsman quite compelling, right? If you see a master craftsman at work, it can be marvelous, because we are witnessing someone with great skill, operating with great precision, with tremendous focus, and exquisite attention to detail, right? And when we see human beings do that, we say that is extraordinary performance. That's exceptional behavior. And we quite rationally say, well, that's going to lead to premium results. That's going to lead to high quality results. Well, robots are not like human beings. A robot will be able to and will perform every task, every single task, as well as it can perform it. At the precision it's capable of performing it every single time, consistently. It's not going to come in and have a bad day. It's not going to come into work hungover. It's not going to be bored or angry or frustrated or ill. And on that day, its quality or its precision or its focus will lapse, and the result will be some deterioration in the final result of the production process. It's simply not going to occur. And so these are the sorts of reasons. And the other one that you mentioned, the cost, the absolute cost of labor shrinking, is going to collapse the distance, both absolute and relative, between premium and low-end goods. And so, sure, if a high-end pair of shoes, I'm just picking a pair of shoes with the master craftsman example in mind. But if a high-end pair of shoes costs $200 and a cheap pair of shoes costs $20, that's a big difference, a material difference in terms of today's dollars. Okay. But if a high-end pair of shoes in 2044, 20 years from now, costs the equivalent in today's dollars of if the high-end costs $2, and the low end costs, $1.95, which are you going to buy every single time?
Yeah, of course.
So this is part of what the thinking is. It's both the absolute cost, the absolute scale, and the relative difference between high-end goods and low-end goods will simply shrink. And it may not disappear altogether because of cost of goods, cost of materials, but it will certainly shrink substantially. And the overall effect of that is we're going to be looking around over the next 2 decades, and it's going to seem as though the quality of everything, everywhere we look, is on the rise. That's what it's going to feel.
Great. Yeah. I think that you could claim that's already happened to a lesser degree since I was a child. That generally speaking, cars are made better than, just not including the electronics and the fancy stuff, just the quality of a vehicle is better than it was in 1980 or something. And the quality
for many goods and services.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's deflationary too, which is really interesting. That's a fascinating aspect of it, is that this, you're saying it's $2 a pair. It's hard to imagine. It's like, you can't buy a pair of shoes for $2, but they
there's all kinds of stuff there's all kinds of stuff online via Amazon where you can't imagine how is it possible to sell something for just a couple of bucks and deliver it for free. I mean, the cost of things that are available today is already quite extraordinarily low compared to, say, for example, the world before the internet. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we already are on that trajectory towards material abundance and prosperity.
Just accelerate that.
It's just going to just rocket up the exponential curve from here.
Okay. So speaking of that, 2 more points here. The first one is the soft takeoff. You talked about how we have this critically important sort of gap where there's going to be a period of time where the bots are going to take on tasks, not jobs, but tasks that dull, dirty, dangerous, things that people don't want to do right now, where there actually literally is a hole in the job market, generally speaking.
Yes.
So what does that grant us? That little soft takeoff ramp, what should we be doing today to take advantage of that?
Well, for the start is absolutely to be aware of all of this, that the disruption is inevitable, that it's coming fast, and that, as you mentioned, in this interim period, at first, we could be lulled into a false sense of security by thinking, look, that in the first 5 years, we've deployed some millions or tens of millions of humanoid robots. And you know what? They haven't put that many people out of work. They've actually just made factories and businesses more productive. Maybe they've even made individual employees. Maybe they've made individual people more productive in their jobs. And maybe they just look like a force multiplier, a productivity multiplier. And that's because very likely at the beginning, humanoid robots will be used to fill, like you said, holes in demand and supply, right? The mismatch right there. So today there are labor shortages across the board for a variety of reasons. One is that it's simply difficult. There's friction transactionally. It's hard for employers and employees to find each other perfectly, and then not every employee is willing to relocate to where an employer wants them to be. And there are many reasons why even if in principle a person could and would do the job, it's still there's still enough friction that the work doesn't get done. Then on top of that, there's an absolutely staggering amount of latent demand in the world, in the global economy. And this is work that just no person is willing to do, because no employer is willing to pay that much for it. It's just not valuable enough. And but when the marginal cost of labor approaches zero, or as it does, humanoid robots will be doing things that are either too dirty or too dangerous or too dull for a human being to be willing to do today, right? And
Right.
this is more true in some societies than others, but tragically, right? But
Yeah.
there are many
Yeah.
jobs that are just, say, for example, in the United States, there are many jobs that employers would love to have done, but nobody's going to work for $1 an hour in dangerous circumstances to do them.
Right.
It's people just are not willing to make that choice, and fair enough. But robots will.
Yeah.
And so there will be a time when those sorts of tasks are what are drawing the initial supply of robots towards.
Right. Right.
Now, what that means is not that the robots will never disrupt labor, or that they'll never create technological unemployment, that they'll never put human beings out of work. They will. That's all still inevitable.
Right.
What it means is it just won't happen exponentially starting from day one.
Right.
At least that's what our modeling suggests.
Right.
Now, what does that spell for us? It says that we have a brief period of time when this disruption is going to begin, when the robots start rolling out, when they start entering the economy, and before people start losing their jobs to them. People start having their livelihoods upended. Entire regions start seeing their economies and way of life transformed.
Right.
And that, perhaps fortunately, gives us an opportunity for planning, for reacting, for testing and experimenting, for piloting, for figuring out how to get ready for the inevitable.
Right.
And thank goodness, let's hope we have a number of years when we can do that learning, make those preparations, get ready, and then take advantage of the incredible opportunity that humanoid robots in this disruption present, while also at the same time minimizing the collateral damage, the harm to individuals and communities and all of society along the way. So we think that's the right way to think about it.
Yeah. So the big thing is, don't be complacent. If you're thinking like, oh, everything, the robots are, there's 100,000, then 1 million, and nothing's happened so far. It's like, that's just the dam breaking. And so
that's exactly it.
Yeah. So let's turn to, I know, your topic in the world, and that is the future of prosperity and abundance in a better environment. I know with last time we talked, you specifically talked about how prosperity is the only solution to environmental problems. And it made so much sense when you told me, but so like, how does this new labor force become a multiplier or a way towards getting to that prosperous, environmentally sound future, not an apocalypse where there's just these things roaming around desert landscapes and stuff? Yeah.
Well, the way I like to frame it is that prosperity is one definition of prosperity that you could think about is problem solving capacity. That's one way to think about what prosperity is, right? We see the world as one way, and we wish it were another way, great or small, little things in our lives or big things in our lives. Right. The world, we look around us, we see it's one way. The room's messy, we wish it were clean, or the environment is damaged, we wish it was restored to greater ecological integrity, and everything in between. We see the world as one way, and we wish it were another, and we tend to call that situation a problem. And when we make the transformation from the way the world is to the way we would prefer it to be, we call that a solution. We call that solving those problems. Right. Well, what is it that allows us to transform the world around us in desirable ways? It's prosperity. If you don't have prosperity, if you don't have means, you aren't going to be able to change the world in desirable ways. You're going to be stuck with your problems. You're not going to get them solved. And that isn't a path to good outcomes. And it's not a recipe for optimism on any level. If that is a situation to be avoided. Now, what that means is that anything that moves us towards greater prosperity can be leveraged. It's not inevitable. It's a choice. It can be leveraged. That prosperity can be utilized to solve problems. It doesn't automatically mean that we will. Right. And this is what the environmental community is quite correct about and is often despondent about. We have a lot of material prosperity around us. We aren't doing enough. We aren't committing enough of that to solving certain problems. especially environmental problems, but also many social problems. We have enough
Right.
prosperity that we could solve them, and we're not doing a good enough job. But ultimately, if you have enough prosperity so that you're not trading off between solutions, I have a bit of prosperity, but I can only solve social problems or solve environmental problems. I've got to pick between the two. That's a tough situation to be in, and we're definitely still in that situation.
Right.
If we achieve enough prosperity, if we have a superabundance of labor, if we have a superabundance of clean energy, if we have a superabundance of clean and not impactful transportation and food, then that prosperity will just be overwhelming.
Right.
And there will be so little trade-off, it becomes a no-brainer to start solving problems great and small. And then, of course, there are some problems that are so great that they seem to exceed even the prosperity we have today to deal with. Climate change is one of those. It just seems like it's too big to tackle. But if we had 10 or 100 times greater prosperity by mid-century than we do today, then even enormous problems become much, much more tractable. Right. And so that is the sort of the general picture for why these disruptions, energy, transportation, food, and labor, are they are the key to solving problems of all kinds, and certainly environmental ones. And of course, that's what my book Brighter is about, and focuses on that and the 4 disruptions and the role they play. And then the other thing to think about is that the 4 disruptions they feed into and accelerate one another. And that's extraordinary, right? Yeah. The disruption of energy, the availability of clean energy at a decreasing cost and eventually at a marginal cost that approaches zero, that turbocharges all of the other disruptions and rockets us upwards on the trajectory to greater prosperity. Right. All that clean electricity, if that's used in the manufacture and the operation of robots, well, then that's just an accelerant, right? And vice versa. If robots are then used to cheaply manufacture solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and deploy them, and to do environmental cleanup along the way, so that the damage and the impacts of mining and resource procurement and recycling and all of the rest of things we must do are managed, and they can be managed, and the footprint is kept small and eventually shrunken to hopefully to minimal level, then we can accelerate all of this and head up this extraordinary trajectory of progress towards greater and greater prosperity. And it doesn't mean that we're going to have some dystopian Terminator future where the entire world is paved over with machines. That's not what that means at all. All it means is that we're going to have greater freedom and greater choice to reshape the world in desirable ways. And I think most of us desire a world, maybe not literally everybody, but almost all of us desire a world that where there are marvelous wilderness areas, and there are untrammeled parts of nature, and there are great reservoirs of ecological prosperity and biodiversity and so forth. We don't want a world where for our children that doesn't have those things. Of course we don't. So the idea that we've sort of on this uncontrollable Frankenstein's monster that's just going to devour the planet, that's not I don't regard that as serious thinking at all. What I see instead is these are incredibly powerful tools. They spell an extraordinary trajectory towards prosperity that for previous generations might have seemed all but impossible to imagine, just pure science fiction, but here we are. Right?
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And this is something to be celebrated, certainly. But there'll be bumps along the way, and we need to manage those. We need to be cognizant of those. We need to plan appropriately and be responsible. But I see an enormous upside and a very manageable downside. And I hope that if we can begin this conversation soon enough, and we can get experimenting and learning soon enough, then we really can ride this rocket ship to a truly marvelous future. So I'm very excited about it, and that isn't to say that there's no risk, and isn't to say we can be completely cavalier about everything and not worry. But the promise here enormously outweighs the peril in my mind. So we've got a lot of hard work to do. work. We're talking about the disruption of labor and work, but we humans still have a lot of hard work to do, even if it's just good thinking and good decitions, and
Right.
it's less and less toil. Thank goodness.
Right.
So we've still got a lot of hard work to do, but as I like to say, our future is a lot brighter than you think.
There we go. I think we'll just finish with that. That's excellent. I love it. I mean, what else are you going to say? And by the way, your book is excellent. I read the book. It is really, really good. Yeah. And definitely everybody check out the blog. Again, I'll put a link in the description. So this time we're the horses. So hopefully we won't all end up in the glue factory. We will all end up being the horses on the farms that, get to have a really good life. So there you go. We'll have that instead.
There you go.
Thank you so much, Adam. I really did. I learned a ton. It was very, very informative and also inspiring. It just makes me happy about the future, happy to get up tomorrow and work hard to try to make this better. Really appreciate it. Thank you again for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Everybody check out Adam on X and RethinkX and all that stuff. I'll leave all that stuff in the description. In the meantime, everybody have a lovely day and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.